And our first speaker is Benjamin Zawacki, who is the Southeast Asia Regional Representative of the International Development Law Organization, an intergovernmental body focused on human rights and the rule of law. For 5 years through August of this year, Benjamin was an Asia researcher for Amnesty International, where he was responsible for all human rights research and advocacy pertaining to Thailand, Myanmar, and regional emergencies. He previously worked with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the Jesuit Refugee Service in Thailand and East Africa. His publications range from opinion editorials to legal journals to institutional reports, and he's been extensively quoted in both regional and global media. He has a law degree from the George Washington University Law School, and he's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. And the title of his talk is Rhetoric versus Law, Defining Myanmar's Rohingya Problem. And please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much. And let me join the other panelists in thanking the organizers for having this event at all, much less having it so geographically far away from where it's taking place. I say that with no sense of irony whatsoever. I think it's a credit to the University of Illinois that you would be focused on something in Myanmar at all, in the middle of the Midwest of the United States. And of course, I'm very honored to be a part of it. Much has been written lately, either empathetically or as a challenge, of Myanmar's Rohingya problem. Since early June 2012, the Rohingya have borne the brunt of communal violence, human rights violations, and an urgent humanitarian situation in Rakhine State. A great deal of rhetoric has attended these accounts by officials and citizens of Myanmar, Rohingya organizations, journalists, human rights groups, and others, essentially attaching labels to the situation. And while there have been a number of thoughtful attempts to define or even explain the Rohingya problem in historical or political terms, they have been largely drowned out by emotive outbursts and media-friendly sound bites. This is not only unfortunate, it is also consequential. For as much in evidence since June, rhetoric can influence both the way in which a crisis plays out as well as in how it is responded to. In other words, how we talk about what it is we're talking about matters. What do we mean when we talk about the Rohingya problem? In proffering a modest definition, two distinct but related areas warrant particular examination. One, nationality and discrimination, which focuses exclusively on Myanmar, and two, statelessness and displacement, which implicates Myanmar's neighbors as well. Time limitations today, as well as the fluidity of the situation in Rakhine State, require that I not address a third area on the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, but I will do so in the published version of these remarks in due course, and I also note that I won't be able to go into, as much as I would like, the notion of rhetoric, and I won't be able to provide examples, given the time limitations today, on what I mean by rhetoric. But again, more generally, what I mean are the ways in which the Rohingya problem is characterized, politically, legally, etc. And we've seen some evidence of that even today in the panel thus far, many different ways of characterizing the Rohingya problem. So I begin with nationality and discrimination. The events of 2012, as well as the violent events of 1978, 1992, 2001, and 2009, are attributable, in my view, to systemic discrimination against the Rohingya in Myanmar. That is, to a political, social, and economic system manifested in law, policy, and practice designed to discriminate against this ethnic and religious minority. This system makes such direct violence against the Rohingya far more possible and likely than it would otherwise be. Further, in the eyes of Myanmar authorities at least, as evidenced by the lack of accountability for civilians and officials alike, discrimination also makes the violence and violations somehow justifiable. This is the Rohingya problem boiled down to its most basic element. In 1978's Dragon King operation, the Myanmar army committed widespread killings and rape of Rohingya civilians and carried out the destruction of mosques and other religious persecution that resulted in the exodus of an estimated 200,000 Rohingya to neighboring Bangladesh. Another campaign of forced labor, summary executions, torture, and rape in 1992 led to a similar number of Rohingya again fleeing across the border. In February 2001, communal violence between the Muslim and Buddhist populations in Sichuan resulted in an unknown number of people killed and Muslim property destroyed. And late 2009 featured the pushing back by Thai authorities onto the high seas of several boats lacking adequate food, water, and fuel of Rohingyas in the Andaman Sea. It is true that all of these events have similar, separate equivalents in countries in which systemic discrimination does not take place. Yet in Myanmar, such discrimination provides the violence with a ready-made antecedent, expressly approved by the state. Indeed, to varying degrees, the 5 seminal events noted above were simply exacerbations of this underlying discrimination, alarming episodic symptoms of a chronic legal, political, and economic illness. It would overstate the causality to assert that if Myanmar had never put its systemic discrimination into place against the Rohingyas, these events would not have occurred. Eliminating it, however, is urgently required for a sustainable future peace in Rakhine State, and equally important is a human rights imperative. The system's anchor is the 1982 Citizenship Law, which in both design and implementation effectively denies the right to a nationality to the Rohingya population. It supersedes all previous citizenship regimes in Myanmar of 1947, 1948, and 1974. The 1982 Citizenship Law creates 3 classes of citizens: full, associate, and naturalized, none of which has been conferred on most Rohingyas. Full citizenship is reserved for those whose ancestors settled in Myanmar before the year 1823, or are among Myanmar's more than 130 recognized national ethnic groups, of which the Rohingya is not one. Associate citizens are those who were both eligible and applied for citizenship under the previous 1948 law. This required an awareness of the law that few Rohingya had, and a level of proof that even fewer were able to provide. Likewise, with naturalized citizenship, eligible for those who resided in Myanmar for 5 continuous years on or before 1948. Moreover, with all 3 classes, a central body has the discretion to deny citizenship, even where the criteria are met. The 1982 Citizenship Law's discriminatory effects are also extremely consequential. The main one is that the Rohingya, lacking citizenship in Myanmar, have been rendered stateless, both unable to avail themselves of the protection of the state and, as has been the case for decades, subject to policies and practices which constitute violations of their human rights and fundamental freedoms. These include restrictions on movement, forced labor, land confiscation, forced eviction and destruction of houses, extortion and arbitrary taxation, and restrictions on marriage, employment, health care, and education. While not limited to the Rohingyas, these are not imposed in the same manner and to the same degree on Buddhists or other Muslims in Rakhine State, or for that matter, on other ethnic minorities across the country. This is systemic discrimination. Laws, policies, and practices, though designed and carried out by people, are ultimately part of or attributable to a system that ensures discrimination even in the absence of discriminatory individuals. And it is patently unlawful. As a member of the United Nations, Myanmar is legally obliged to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without discrimination as to race, sex, language, or religion, as is written in Articles 55 and 56 of the UN Charter. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although admittedly not a binding document, provides in Article 15 that, quote, everyone has the right to a nationality. Article 2 holds that everyone is entitled to all the rights in the Declaration, quote, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So significant is this anti-discrimination language that it can be found in 5 more international human rights documents. One of them is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is not only binding on states that have ratified it, but counts Myanmar among those states. Myanmar is also a state party to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. According to Amnesty International, it is a violation, quote, to be deprived of one's rights because of a characteristic that one cannot change, such as one's race or ethnic origin, or because of a characteristic that is so central to one's being that it should not be forced to change it, such as religion. In addition, Article 7 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child provides for the right of a child to a nationality, quote, in particular where the child would otherwise be stateless. Article 9 of the Women's Convention states, quote, states parties shall grant women equal rights with men to acquire, change, or retain their nationality, and with respect to the nationality of their children. It is clear that Myanmar, as a state party to both of these conventions, is in violation of its international legal obligations pertaining to the rights of Rohingya children and women to a nationality. A solution? Myanmar should substantially amend the 1982 citizenship law or repeal and redraft it, such that the Rohingyas are indisputably made citizens. Rohingyas born in Myanmar who would otherwise be stateless should be granted citizenship, as should those who are not born there but are able to establish a genuine and effective link to the country. Myanmar should also eliminate its policies and practice that discriminate against the Rohingya on the grounds of their ethnicity and or religion. More than any other single step, dismantling its system of discrimination would bring Myanmar's Rohingya problem closer to a solution. And I'll turn now to statelessness and displacement. Myanmar's Rohingyas have been deprived of a nationality and as such are stateless. The human rights effects of this, both for Rohingyas inside Myanmar and those living as refugees abroad, are substantial. Inside Myanmar, a kind of circularity exists, whereby systemic discrimination renders the Rohingya stateless, while their status as a stateless population acts as further violation for discrimination and persecution by the state and its citizens. This is why the right to a nationality has been repeatedly described as the right to have rights. This description, however, is only correct in fact, but not as a matter of law. All human rights belonging to citizens also belong to stateless persons. Immigration law may legitimately distinguish between those with and those without a nationality. But just as states, having the authority to confer nationality, but not to deny it on the basis of ethnicity or religion, likewise cannot apply immigration law at the expense of basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. Similarly, while human rights law does allow for the conditional suspension of certain rights during emergencies, it does not permit derogation from the right to life and other fundamental rights vis-a-vis stateless persons. There are 2 international treaties on statelessness, neither of which has Myanmar signed or ratified. At first glance, the convention relating to the status of stateless persons would seem to be the more relevant to the Rohingya, for it pertains to the treatment of de jure stateless persons. A de jure stateless person is one who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Both its preamble and Article 3 contain non-discrimination clauses, while other provisions are favorable to stateless persons in respect to religion, property, employment, education, public assistance, and social security, all of which recall the situation of the Rohingyas in Myanmar. Yet this convention reflects and thus actually contributes to the circularity in Myanmar described above, as it only applies to de jure stateless persons deemed to be legally residing in the country at issue. Well, as we've seen, because of the 1982 citizenship law, the Rohingyas are not deemed to be in Myanmar legally, making the convention inapplicable. The convention effectively, quote, scores an own goal, if you will, by allowing states through the very discrimination it was designed to contest, to opt out of adhering to its provisions. The Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, on the other hand, obliges state parties to prevent, reduce, and avoid statelessness through taking certain positive measures, especially by granting, quote, its nationality to persons born in its territory who would otherwise be stateless. This convention is thus far more relevant to Myanmar's Rohingyas and should be the focus of increased advocacy as a solution to the problem associated with them. At least hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas have been physically displaced over the past 25 years, both internally and outside of Myanmar. The 5 seminal events I noted before in 1978, 92, 2001, 2009, and 2012, although hardly an exhaustive list, all featured or resulted in such displacement. Internally, not only has communal violence displaced Rohingyas, but state policy, practice, and participation, including in either instigating or failing to stop communal violence, have accounted for internal displacement as well. An estimated 100,000 Rohingyas are still in camps away from their homes in the wake of this year's clashes. State authorities have forcibly or arbitrarily transferred Rohingyas over the years through militarization of northern Rakhine State, land confiscation, eviction from homes and homesteads, and the construction of model villages. The UN Guiding Principles on Internally Displaced Persons, with their focus on rights and non-discrimination, should form the basis of the Myanmar government's treatment of these internally displaced Rohingyas, but clearly they do not. The principles apply to all of those internally displaced, including stateless persons. It is believed that more Rohingyas live outside of Myanmar than the estimated 800,000 who live inside the country. An involuntary diaspora resulting from 2.5 decades of both overt, forced deportation and removal by state authorities, as well as communal violence state policy has facilitated. These people are not simply refugees, a difficult enough status to cope with, but stateless persons outside their territory of habitual and historical residence. This status does not change the root cause of the Rohingya problem, but it does extend the focus beyond Myanmar alone and onto its immediate and regional neighbors. Saudi Arabia is thought to host 500,000 Rohingyas. In Bangladesh, the country that has and continues to host the largest number of recognized and unrecognized Rohingya refugees, 29,000 live in official camps, while another 200,000 or so live in makeshift settlements or amidst the local border population. Smaller populations of Rohingyas reside in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and India. October each year marks the start of the annual 6-month sailing season, whereby Rohingyas flee persecution in Myanmar via people smugglers on boats that are often unseaworthy. None of these countries fully respects the Rohingyas' right to seek and enjoy asylum, or the right to not be sent back to a country in which they have a well-founded fear of persecution, on grounds, among others, of ethnicity or religion. Known as non-refoulement, this principle makes irrelevant the fact that the countries mentioned above are not states party to the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. The principle of non-refoulement is essentially a prohibition against involuntarily returning asylum seekers and refugees, and it is a matter of customary international law, meaning that it applies regardless of a country's treaty status. Instead, citing immigration concerns, economic incentives or constraints, or national security, all of the countries noted have resorted to detention, forced repatriation, the deprivation of basic necessities on the high seas, and or informal deportation to traffickers. The human rights and humanitarian records of Bangladesh and Thailand in particular have long been notably poor in relation to the Rohingya. As such, they are in breach of their international legal obligations pertaining to asylum seekers and refugees. Along with ending systemic discrimination in Myanmar, a solution to the Rohingya problem would be significantly advanced if Myanmar and its regional neighbors abided by the human rights provisions pertaining to stateless persons and refugees. Thanks very much.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.